Alright, I apologize for the lateness of this video. Things got in the way this week, but hopefully you do have a chance to watch it before we cover it in class. But this is our last Unit 5 video. Our Part 4 is going to cover the remaining topics we have in Unit 5, and that starts with urbanization. Now, urbanization covers the movement of people basically into and the creation of city areas, as well as the creation of what we now refer to as suburbs. The main environmental issues that we're going to look at is the removal of natural vegetation and ecosystems, and the replacement of permeable soils that allow water to pass through them with impervious surfaces. That's going to create a lot of runoff, which means that the water itself is going to run off and not replenish the soils, not replenish natural aquifers. And instead, when we have too much rain, or any rains, any water, all of that is going to, any precipitation, all of that is going to end up in sewers. The problem with that is that the sewers are going to eventually lead to rivers, bays, estuaries, and eventually the ocean, meaning that we're adding more water potentially to our oceans than what would normally be infiltrating into the ground. The other problem is an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions, because with urbanization, you have a lot more human activity, you have a lot more construction, you have a lot more human activity that, the driving of cars, the using of energy in concentrated areas. We have the loss of the natural ecosystems, including deforestation. So we're losing that carbon sequestration that would normally take carbon out of the atmosphere. And you're going to have the creation of landfills, which we'll get to in a future unit, to dispose of that trash. And landfills are also a source of generating greenhouse gas emissions. One quick note on coastal cities is the potential for saltwater intrusion when it comes to pumping of water from underground. This is a possibility that can happen in coastal cities, but really just to cover the topic of saltwater intrusion. When you have water being pumped in an area that is near coastlines, the barrier between the freshwater aquifer and the saltwater from the ocean is thinner, meaning that you can start pumping saltwater into the areas where freshwater is. There's many islands that experience this, and places where the water that is used, say out of their faucets, tends to have maybe a higher salt concentration. I personally experienced this in the islands in Greece, where the water itself that was used in, say, like the sinks and the showers had a higher than normal salt content, and as a result, you feel that more on your skin, leading to use of more oils, lotions, things like that that people will use to try and counteract the excessive saltiness that happens there. Now, when it comes to going back a little bit to our population unit, when you have growing populations, you also have growing urbanization. Populations will tend to move into areas, into denser populated areas away from the rural areas, the countryside, and they'll move into cities. So we're going to talk about the whole progression here. We saw this happen post-industrial revolution here in the United States. That's when we had our formation of many large cities as people moved into these areas for various reasons. The number one being jobs, but also with jobs came the need for supplemental things, entertainment, as well as the ability to meet the needs through goods and services of the people themselves that were moving into those cities. Now, one thought on urbanization is that, well, if you have lots of people living in a densely populated area, there is the benefit of less driving and car use, as well as less land use per person, which would potentially lower the environmental impact for that person using less land, taking up less land where they live, because we're talking about lots of large buildings, apartment buildings, people living in smaller areas because they're more densely populated. However, the most growth that we see is not actually urban anymore, at least in the United States, it's the idea of the suburban growth and suburban populations, people moving out of the city. So where we live in New Jersey would be considered suburbs, metropolitan suburbs of areas like New York City, because we're close to, even though not connected to the economy of New York City anymore, the growth of the suburbs were linked largely with people who had moved to these cities for those initial early jobs, and then once they were able to, gain wealth and start to basically make more money than they had as, say, smaller workers, rural workers, farmers, things like that. People over time started to move into the surrounding areas where they were able to have less population, as well as more space to take advantage of with the money that they had started to make. This is what we call urban sprawl. People starting to move from urban areas, urban centers, into the less dense suburban surroundings. Reasons being, you have more money and it's now cheaper. You can get a larger home as opposed to a smaller apartment inside of a city. The advent of cars in our highway system made it much easier to access the city, the urban area, while still living slightly disconnected from it. Now, with that, however, that's going to mean more driving, and more driving is going to increase a person's ecological footprint and increase their own CO2 emissions. Now, this leads to an urban decline, however, inside the city, where the infrastructure of that city is going to start to decay and erode potentially because tax revenues go down. As a result, we start to see taxes go up, and some of these places become the most expensive ones to live in. There are many cities that have experienced this urban decline. We'll talk about a few specific examples in class of cities, major cities in the United States that, going back to, say, the 1950s when urban sprawl really kicked off in the United States, to see what their populations have declined by from their peaks. So this urban blight is the result of abandoned living spaces and businesses now, because if there's no people, businesses are also going to potentially move out of these areas as well. So more people leave, and it creates a positive feedback loop. So we talked about the highway system increasing in driving and highway expansion. One of the ways to combat urban decline is what's called mixed land use, where we start to see residential businesses and many things being used in the same areas of the city. This is, something that's going to enable walkability and a sense of place where a person doesn't feel like they need to, say, drive very far, but they're also still able to enjoy some of the peace and quietness that goes with having your own place and being able to take advantage of both of those. So we see a lot of these start to pop up where you have homes and apartment buildings and complexes that are located very close to centers of business as well. Now, I'm going to go pretty quickly through the ecological footprint stuff because we did cover this at the beginning of the year. To recall, it's basically a way to calculate how much a person consumes, their footprint or their impact on the planet expressed as an area of land, calculating in things like energy use, consumption, the amount of land needed to grow their food, take care of their waste, all of that. Now, this is slightly different from a carbon footprint. You can see we have a screenshot here as an example for from this exact same website we used at the beginning of the year. And carbon footprint just focuses specifically on the CO2 releasing activities. This is usually measured in tons per year, whereas the ecological footprint is measured as an area of land. Obviously, we want to do things that are going to decrease our ecological and carbon footprints. That means more access and use and the installation of renewable energy sources as opposed to fossil fuels, use of more public transportations, consumption of less meat, and just consumption in general of less things, right? The more you do, the more you use, the more waste you create, the more that contributes to your personal ecological footprint. The concern is obviously that, we looked at this whole if the whole world lived like us deal. In the United States, we have very high ecological footprints because of our society and culture. The current average footprint adds up to 5.1 Earths if everybody on the planet, all 8 billion people, consumed resources the way the average American does. And obviously that's unsustainable because we only have 1 Earth's worth of planet and not 5. The current global footprint is still above 1. It's about 1.85. Every year, somewhere around August, we have our past day. The name of it is actually escaping me at the moment, but it's basically the day where we've used and acknowledged, all right, 1 year's worth of resources, as far as the ecological footprint is concerned, have been used up, which means everything else becomes a deficit. Now, one topic we have not talked about in general is sustainability. I didn't cover this in the agricultural stuff because this becomes a topic beyond agriculture. It also has to do with our own personal uses. But the concept of sustainability means using a resource or using something in a way that does not deplete it or degrade it for future generations. And obviously, any sustainable activity, whether it's farming or whether it's personal use, is something that we're going to try to opt for. There are indicators of sustainability. Some of the ones we look at as far as environmental science is concerned is biodiversity. Obviously, a higher biodiversity means that ecosystem is more sustainable. As extinctions increase, we know that biodiversity is decreasing. So obviously, the higher the extinction rates around the world for all different species, that's telling us that indicator is trending in the wrong direction. Food production is another one, where our increasing consumption of meat globally is an unsustainable practice, as well as the over-farming through a lot of modern farming techniques that leads to depletion of soil and water. CO2 levels is another method of looking at sustainability, and we'll talk more about the CO2 impacts in a future unit. But as CO2 levels increase and temperatures warm, that's another sign of unsustainable practices. Population growth and resource depletion go hand in hand. As the human population increases, our resource depletion also increases, meaning we're using more stuff, more raw materials, more water, more clean air to basically handle and deal with all of our demands. And then the last topic is urban runoff. We already mentioned the idea of infiltration decreasing with urbanization, impervious surfaces, your sidewalks, concrete, pavement, asphalt, parking lots, roads, things like that, all reduce the amount of water that recharges into the ground naturally and washes away. With the water, it's also going to take pollutants off of those impervious surfaces. So think fuels, gasolines, garbage, sediments, oils, things like that. We're at the time of year around here where we see a lot of excess salt in the runoff because of all the extra salting that goes on to prevent roads from freezing. Sediment is always going to be one through erosion, fertilizers, which can lead to eutrophication, pesticides, which can lead to effects on non-targeted species like aquatic organisms, fish, things like that. and then oils and gasolines, which can lead to reach toxic levels for organisms. The concept of permeable pavement has become a big one, where companies are researching and looking at ways to replace impervious surfaces with pavement. We're talking roads and parking lots and sidewalks that do allow water to pass through them. They decrease runoff, decrease the pollutants that are carried into the bodies of water as well, decrease the likelihoods of flooding, which becomes a big problem when we have larger storms and increased storms that result from climate change. The problem is, as with most things that we look at, it tends to be more costly, which is why it's harder to implement. Rain gardens are another example. These are things in green spaces that are planted in urban areas into the natural soil as a way to add more water back into the natural ground cover. Obviously, it's going to decrease runoff by allowing that water to pass through the soil and not get stuck on the hard surfaces, as well as decreasing flooding and allowing that water to get back into the soil and potentially recharge the groundwater tables. We mentioned public transportation before as a way to cut down on CO2 emissions. More cars is going to mean more roadways, and more cars is going to also mean more roadways and more parking lots and places for those cars to be at any point in time, which means more impervious surfaces, more roads and parking lots are needed. And public transit reduces the need for all of this. There's a few examples we'll talk about where different cities in different parts of the world have removed highways as part of their public transit increases, and increase the amount of green space as opposed to what was previously there. Building up, not out is another one. The idea of building vertically, which many cities do as well, but not so much in the suburbs, because people move to the suburbs for the space and the value of being on one's own land or being on a greater patch of land, is another way to decrease the impacts of urbanization. When building vertically, it also allows for the concepts of green roofs or rooftop gardens that will also be able to collect some of that precipitation and decrease urban runoff as well. Green roofs as well as rain gardens also act as a means of sequestering carbon, pulling CO2 out through photosynthesis, as well as pulling out other air pollutants. So those were the remaining topics that we had. I again apologize for the late posting of this video, but I hope you get a chance to check it out before we discuss these topics in class.